Loss was no longer a possibility. It was a countdown. We had already calculated the outcome, already simulated every defensive line, every fallback position, every last desperate maneuver, and every single one ended the same way, with us buried beneath the weight of the Virex dominion. They didn't rush. They didn't panic. They didn't need to, because their way of war was patience. They advanced like a wall, slow, unstoppable, crushing everything in front of them without ever breaking formation. And we were trapped. The canyon fortress of Corrales had once been our strongest defensive position. High cliffs, narrow choke points, natural barriers that should have made invasion impossible. But we had made one mistake. We assumed the enemy would try to break through. Instead, they surrounded us, cut off every exit, sealed every supply route, and then they waited. Days passed, then weeks. Our resources dwindled, our defenses weakened, and still they kept coming, not in waves, not in charges, but in pressure, constant, relentless. I remember the moment we knew it was over. The outer ridge fell, not with a battle, but with silence. Our forward scouts stopped responding. Alna, B1, until there was nothing left but static. That's when command gave the order. Prepare for final defense. No reinforcements. No evacuation. No survival. Just delay. Delay long enough for someone, somewhere, to learn from our failure. We weren't soldiers anymore. We were a lesson. And then the humans arrived. Not in formation. Not with ceremony. Not even on time. They came in damaged transports, half their equipment missing, arguing over comms like they hadn't realized where they were. At first, we thought it was a mistake, that someone had sent the wrong unit. Because these weren't elite troops. They weren't disciplined. They weren't even organized. They were loud, disordered, unpredictable, and completely out of place in a battlefield that demanded precision. I remember one of our commanders saying it out loud. "These are your reinforcements?" There was no response, because even the humans didn't seem convinced, until one of them stepped forward. No rank insignia worth mentioning. Armor scratched, weapon modified beyond standard regulation, and an expression that didn't match the situation at all. Not fear, not urgency, but something else. Something calculating. He looked out over the canyon, at the advancing Virex lines in the distance, at the cliffs, at the narrow passes, at the dust hanging in the air like a waiting storm. And then he smiled, not because he thought we would survive, but because he had just seen something no one else had. "Yeah," he said quietly, "this place is perfect. Perfect." That was the word. The word no one had used in weeks. The word that didn't belong on a battlefield like this. And yet, coming from him, it didn't sound like hope. It sounded like a warning. Because while we had been preparing to die, Sergeant Kyle Ryden had just started planning something else. No one trusted the humans. That was the first truth. Not because they were weak, but because they didn't fight like anyone else. Every species in the Alliance had its doctrine. The Cathari relied on brute force. The Lurian specialized in precision strikes. The Vol used coordinated formations, so perfect they looked mechanical. But humans didn't follow patterns. They broke them. And on a battlefield like Corrales, where every movement had to be calculated, where every position had to be precise, unpredictability wasn't seen as strength. It was seen as liability. And Sergeant Kale Ryden was the worst of them. I watched the first strategy meeting after their arrival. If you could call it a strategy meeting, it was more like controlled panic. Holographic maps flickered in the center of the command chamber. Enemy positions marked in deep red. Advancing lines creeping closer, hour by hour. Every commander in the room knew the truth. There were no good options left, only slower ways to lose. Outer ridge is compromised. one officer said. Inner defenses will hold for approximately 11 hours under sustained pressure. Supplies will last 9. Silence followed, because everyone understood what that meant. We wouldn't even last long enough to run out of ammunition. That's when Kyle spoke. Not loudly, not dramatically, just casually. Why are we holding the ridge at all? The room didn't react at first, because no one expected him to speak. Then someone turned, slowly, annoyed, because it delays their advance. A Vol tactician replied. Kale tilted his head slightly. By how much? A pause. Approximately 2 hours. Kale nodded, like he had just confirmed something simple. Then we're wasting it. That got attention. Real attention. What? The tactician snapped. We're using the ridge wrong, Kale said. We're treating it like a wall. He gestured toward the map. It's not a wall. It's a trigger. Silence again. But this time, it wasn't dismissal. It was irritation. Because no one likes being told they're wrong, especially not in the final hours before death. And what exactly do you suggest? Another commander asked coldly. Kale stepped closer to the projection, zoomed in on the canyon terrain. Cliffs, overhangs, narrow passes. You see a defensive position, he said. I see unstable rock formations, pressure points, and collapse zones. A few of the alien officers exchanged looks, confusion mixed with skepticism. You're suggesting we destroy our own terrain? Someone asked. I'm suggesting we stop letting them use it better than we are. That answer didn't help his case. If anything, it made things worse. The Cathari war leader leaned forward, massive frame casting a shadow over the table. You would collapse the ridge, he said slowly, and remove our only remaining defensive line? Kale didn't hesitate. Yes. The reaction was immediate. That's insanity. We would lose our position instantly. They would overrun us even faster. Voices rose. Arguments collided. The room filled with the sound of commanders rejecting the idea before it could even fully form. And Kale just stood there, listening, waiting, until the noise died down again. You're all thinking in terms of holding, he said quietly. We can't hold. That shut them up. Because it was true. Uncomfortably. Undeniably true. So stop trying, he continued. A dangerous statement. One that bordered on treason in any other situation. We don't hold the ridge, he said. We let them take it. Silence. Heavy. Unforgiving. And then, someone asked. Kale's eyes moved across the map. Tracing paths no one else had noticed. We make sure they regret it. No one spoke after that. Not because they were convinced, but because they didn't understand. And in war, what you don't understand, you don't trust. The meeting ended without a decision, without approval, without even acknowledgement. Kyle's idea wasn't rejected. It was ignored, which in some ways was worse. Later that day, orders were issued, final defensive assignments. Every unit positioned for the inevitable last stand. And Kale? He was given the outer ridge. Not command, not authority, just responsibility for a section no one expected to survive. A position already marked as lost. A delay point. A sacrifice. I found him out there hours later, standing at the edge of the ridge, looking down into the canyon below. The Virex Dominion was visible now. Massive armored forms moving slowly through the lower paths. Endless. Silent. Unstoppable. They gave you the worst position, I said. He didn't look at me. Best position, he corrected. I frowned. You're the first line they'll hit. No, he said. I'm the first line they'll trust. That didn't make sense. Not yet. They think we'll defend it, he continued. They expect resistance. They're counting on it. Finally, he looked at me. And there it was again. That same expression. That same unsettling calm. But we're not going to do what they expect. A faint wind moved across the canyon, carrying dust through the air. Loose rocks shifted underfoot. The cliffs above us creaked, almost imperceptibly. Unstable, dangerous, alive in a way terrain shouldn't be. I looked around, at the cracks in the rock, at the overhangs barely holding together. at the narrow passes that funneled everything into tight corridors. And slowly, I began to understand. Not the full plan. Not yet, but enough to feel it. "You're not defending this position," I said. Kale shook his head. "No, oppose it." "Then I'm setting it up." "For what?" He turned back toward the canyon, toward the advancing enemy, toward the inevitable. And this time, there was no hint of doubt in his voice. For when they think they've already won, war is not always won by strength. Sometimes, it is decided by who understands the battlefield better. And on Corrales, they had been blind, not because we lacked intelligence, but because we were looking at the wrong things. We saw walls. We saw choke points. We saw defensive lines. Kyle saw something else entirely. I stayed with him on the ridge longer than I should have. Long enough to notice the details we had all ignored. The rock beneath our feet wasn't solid. It was layered, compressed over centuries, fractured by time, held together by pressure rather than strength. Tiny cracks ran through the surface like veins, barely visible, but everywhere. Above us, the cliffs loomed high, jagged, uneven. Sections of them leaned outward, as if gravity itself hadn't decided their fate yet. And the wind carried more than dust. It carried sound. Low, deep, almost like the canyon was breathing. "You hear that?" Kale asked. I nodded slowly. "Structural stress," I said. "Instability." He smiled slightly. "Exactly." Then he crouched down, pressed his gloved hand against the ground, fingers tracing one of the cracks. "This place isn't a fortress," he said quietly. "It's a collapse waiting to happen." That was the moment it clicked. Not fully, but enough to feel the shape of it. "You're not trying to defend anything," I said. "You're trying to break it." Kale stood, dust falling from his gloves. "I'm trying to let it break," he corrected. "On them." I looked out across the canyon again. At the Virex advance, their formation hadn't changed. Not once. Slow, but it's easy. Relentless. They didn't adapt. They didn't need to, because nothing had ever forced them to. "They move like that everywhere?" Kale asked. "Yes," I replied. "They rely on pressure and inevitability. No flanking? Minimal. No rapid maneuvers? Unnecessary." He nodded, like he had just confirmed the final piece of a puzzle. "They trust the ground," he said. That sounded like a strange observation, but in context, it was terrifying. "Of course they do," I replied. "Why wouldn't they?" KL didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked up. At the cliffs, at the overhangs barely holding themselves together, at the narrow paths that funneled entire battalions into confined spaces, then back down, at the fractures beneath our feet. "They've never had to question it," he said. "They've never had a reason to. Oppose it. Then, we're going to give them one." For the first time since the humans arrived, I felt something shift inside me. Not hope. Not yet. But possibility. Dangerous. Unstable. Unpredictable possibility. "How?" I asked. Kale turned toward the ridge behind us, where his unit had begun unloading equipment. Not heavy artillery. Not defensive barricades. But something else. Charges. Sensors. Small drilling devices. Tools meant for modification. Not defense. "We don't fight them head on," he said. "We shape where they fight." He pointed toward the canyon floor. "See those paths? Narrow routes, winding between rock formations. The only viable approach for an army of that size. They don't have options," he continued. "They have routes, and we control those routes." I frowned. "Not for long. They'll take this ridge. They'll push through." "Eventually, yes," Kale agreed, "but not before we prepare it." He stepped closer to the edge, voice lower now, more focused. "Every step they take, every formation they tighten, every unit they move forward, they'll be walking exactly where we want them." A chill ran through me, because I finally understood. Not just the idea, but the scale. "You're not planning a defense," I said slowly. Kale shook his head. "No, a beat. I'm planning a collapse." He began outlining it then. Not in full detail. Not all at once, but enough to see the outline of something far bigger than a simple ambush. Charges placed along fault lines. Timed detonations. Not to destroy the enemy directly, but to weaken structural integrity. Controlled collapses. Chain réaction. Dust clouds thick enough to blind sensors, funneling enemy forces into tighter and tighter spaces until they had nowhere left to go. You're turning the entire canyon into a weapon, I said. KL didn't deny it. Not the entire canyon, he corrected. Just the parts they think are safe. That was the key. Not brute force. Not overwhelming firepower. But deception. Making the enemy believe they were advancing normally until the ground itself betrayed them. But this would require precise timing, I said. Perfect coordination. If you trigger too early, they'll adapt. If you trigger too late, they'll break through. And if even one section fails, he finished the sentence for me. Then we defaster. There was no fear in his voice, just acceptance. Because to him, that wasn't a flaw in the plan. It was part of it. All plans fail, he said. You just make sure they fail in your favor. I looked back toward the command center, where the rest of the Alliance forces were still preparing for a traditional last stand. They had no idea what he was about to do. No idea how much everything was about to change. They didn't approve this, I said. KL shrugged. They didn't stop me either. That wasn't reassuring. It was reckless. Borderline insubordination. Maybe worse. You're gambling everything, I said. He finally looked directly at me again. And this time, there was something different in his eyes. Not just calculation, not just confidence, but certainty. No, he said quietly. They already gambled everything when they decided to hold. A long silence followed. The canyon stretched out before us. The enemy kept advancing, unstoppable, unchanging, unaware. And above it all, the cliffs waited, cracked, unstable, ready. You should get back to command, Kale said. They're going to need someone who understands what's about to happen. I didn't move. Do you? I asked. He looked back out over the battlefield one last time, and for the first time, there was something almost human in his expression. Not arrogance, not madness, just quiet resolve. I understand enough, he said. A pause. Then, they think this is their kind of war. His gaze hardened. But they've never fought a battlefield that fights back. War doesn't always begin with explosions. Sometimes, it begins in silence. The kind of silence that hides intention. The kind that builds slowly beneath the surface until it's too late to stop it. That was the kind of war Kyle was preparing. From the command center, it didn't look like strategy. It looked like disorder. Human units moving without clear formation, breaking standard defensive protocols, transporting equipment away from fortified positions instead of reinforcing them. At first, the commanders assumed incompetence. Then, they assumed panic. It wasn't until the reports started coming in that they realized something else was happening. Outer Ridge units are redeploying, one officer said. Redeploying where? The Cathari leader demanded. A pause. Not sure. They're spreading out along the cliff lines. Why? No one had an answer. Because from a traditional standpoint, there was no logical reason. I stood behind the tactical display as new markers appeared across the canyon. Small, precise, placed in patterns that didn't resemble defensive lines. They resembled something else. A grid. Not for holding territory, but for shaping it. Those aren't defensive placements, I said quietly. The room turned toward me. What are they then? Someone asked. I hesitated, because saying it out loud made it sound even more absurd. They're fault line points. Confusion spread across the room. But before anyone could question further, the first detonation happened. Not large, not destructive, just a dull, distant thud, barely visible on the surface. But the sensors picked it up immediately. Microfractures expanding beneath the ridge. Pressure shifting through the rock layers. What was that? A commander demanded. Controlled charge, I replied. Another detonation followed. Then another. Not random. Not chaotic. but spaced, measured, deliberate. And suddenly, the pattern made sense. They're weakening the structure, I said, not collapsing it, preparing it. That's when the room erupted. They're compromising our own defenses. They'll bring the ridge down on us. This is sabotage. Orders were issued immediately. Halt all unauthorized operations. Reinforce structural integrity. Reclaim defensive positions. But by the time those orders reached the outer ridge, it was already too late. Kale didn't stop, because stopping wasn't part of the plan. Out on the ridge, the work continued. I went back to see it myself, and what I saw was not chaos. It was precision. Human soldiers moved with purpose now. No shouting, no confusion. Each team knew exactly where to go, exactly what to place, exactly how long they had. Drilling units carved into the rock. Charges were embedded deep into fault lines. Sensors were placed to monitor stress levels in real time. Every action connected to something larger. Something invisible until you step back far enough to see it. I found Kale near one of the main overhangs, watching as a team secured the final charge beneath a massive rock shelf. That thing falls, I said. It'll take half the ridge with it. Kale nodded. That's the idea. You're destroying your own position. No, he said calmly. I'm relocating it. That didn't make sense. Not yet. Where? I asked. He pointed down, into the canyon, where the Virex forces were advancing steadily, unaware of everything happening above them. There, he said. A cold realization settled in. You're not defending the ridge. You're moving the battlefield. Kale didn't respond, because he didn't need to. The evidence was everywhere. Sections of rock were being weakened in sequence. Not enough to collapse immediately, but enough to fail under pressure, under weight, under movement. They'll trigger it themselves, I said. Kale finally smiled. Exactly. That was the brilliance of it. No single explosion, no obvious attack. Just a series of failures, each one feeding into the next. A chain reaction disguised as natural collapse. Even if the enemy detected something, it would already be too late. How are you timing it? I asked. He gestured toward the sensors. We're not. I frowned. That doesn't make sense. It does if you stop thinking about control, he said. We're not triggering the collapse. They are. A pause. Then, we just decide where it starts. That was when I understood the full risk. This wasn't a precise strike. It wasn't a controlled demolition. It was controlled chaos. A system designed to break itself at the worst possible moment for the worst possible target. And if it doesn't work? I asked. Kale didn't hesitate. Then we fall back to the next layer, which is, he looked toward the inner canyon, where more human teams were already working, setting secondary positions, secondary traps, secondary collapses. There's always another layer, he said. That answer was both reassuring and terrifying, because it meant one thing. He wasn't planning for success. He was planning for survival through failure. Back at command, the situation was becoming impossible to ignore. Structural integrity readings were dropping. Terrain stability was fluctuating. The ridge was no longer reliable. And yet, the enemy kept advancing, unchanged, unaware. They're not reacting, one officer said. They don't see it. They don't need to. Another replied. They'll adapt once it begins. I shook my head. No, I said quietly. They won't. The room turned to me again. Why not? I looked at the display, at the slow, steady movement of the Virex lines, at their perfect formations, their unwavering confidence, because they've never had to. Silence. Heavy, uncertain. And somewhere beyond the canyon walls, the wind shifted. Dust rose into the air, carried across the battlefield in slow, drifting waves. Not enough to obscure vision, but enough to change the light, to blur the edges of things, to make the terrain feel less stable, less certain. Even before anything had begun, the battlefield was already changing. Kale stood at the edge of the ridge as the final charges were set. No hesitation, no doubt, just quiet Focus. I stepped beside him one last time. They're almost here, I said. Far below. The first Virix units reached the outer approach. Massive. Armored. Moving with the same relentless certainty they always had. They are, Kale replied. A long pause. The wind grew stronger. The canyon seemed to hum with tension. And then, he said it. Not loudly. Not dramatically. But with absolute certainty. Good. The most dangerous moment in war is not the attack. It's the moment, just before it begins. When both sides are in position. When everything is ready. And no one has moved yet. That's where we were. Standing on the edge of something none of us could fully control. The Virix Dominion reached the outer ridge at exactly the time predicted. Not early. Not late. Because they didn't rush. They advanced with certainty. With inevitability. Their leading units moved into the canyon approaches in perfect formation. Massive armored bodies stepping forward in synchronized motion. Each movement calculated. Each position reinforced by the one behind it. From above, they looked like a living machine, an organism made of steel and intent. And they never stopped. Not for terrain, not for resistance, not even for uncertainty, because to them, there was no uncertainty. We watched from the ridge as the first units entered the primary choke point, a narrow passage between two towering cliff faces. One of the exact locations Kale had marked. One of the exact places we had prepared. And nothing happened. No explosion. No ambush. No visible réaction. Just the sound of heavy footsteps echoing through the canyon. Slow. Measured. Relentless. They're inside. I said quietly. Kyle didn't respond. He was watching. Not the enemy directly, but the terrain, the cracks, the dust, the subtle shifts in the rock beneath us. Waiting. More units followed, filling the passage, tightening the formation, compressing their own movement space without realizing it. They weren't cautious. They weren't probing, because they didn't expect resistance here. They expected it at the inner defenses, at the final stand, not at the edge of a position we had already abandoned. They think we're retreating, I said. KL nodded slightly. Good. Another column entered. Then another. The canyon floor began to fill, not with chaos, but with order. Rows of armored bodies moving as one. A force designed to overwhelm by presence alone. And still, nothing happened. Minutes passed. Long, uncomfortable minutes. Even the commanders back in the control room began to question it. Why hasn't anything triggered? Someone asked. Are the charges active? Have they failed? Doubt began to spread. Because the longer nothing happened, the more it felt like everything had gone wrong. I felt it too, standing there beside Kale, watching the enemy move deeper into the trap, and wondering if there even was a trap at all. They're almost through the first sector, I said. If we wait any longer, they haven't committed yet, Kale interrupted. His voice was calm, steady, unshaken. They're still testing the ground. That doesn't look like testing, I said. They're advancing in full formation. Exactly. I didn't understand. They don't test cautiously, he continued. They test by committing. Another wave entered the choke point. Heavier units this time. Larger. Denser. Their weight pressing deeper into the canyon floor, into the weakened structure beneath them. And then, something changed. Not visibly, not dramatically, but enough to feel. A faint tremor passed through the ground. Barely noticeable, like a distant echo. Did you feel that? I asked. Kyle didn't answer. His eyes were fixed on the cliff walls, watching, waiting. Another step, another shift. The enemy kept moving, unaware, unconcerned, because nothing had stopped them yet. Another tremor, slightly stronger this time. Dust trickled down from the cliff above. Small fragments of rock falling silently to the ground below. One of the Virix units paused, just for a fraction of a second, then continued forward. They noticed, I said. They dismissed it, Kale replied. That was the weakness, not ignorance, but confidence. They had never encountered terrain that fought back. so they didn't recognize the warning signs. To them, this was nothing. Natural instability. Irrelevant. Insignificant. Another tremor. Stronger. Longer. A deep sound rolled through the canyon. Low and distant. Like something shifting far beneath the surface. Now more units slowed. Not stopping, but adjusting. Their formation tightened further, compressing even more weight into the same narrow space. And that was exactly what KL had been waiting for. "They're committing," he said softly. I looked down at the canyon, at the sheer number of enemy units packed into the choke point now. Layer upon layer of armored bodies, with more still advancing from behind. "They're fully inside," I whispered. Kael exhaled slowly. Not in relief, not in fear, but in readiness. Above us, the cliffs groaned. Long, deep, a natural sound. Cracks widened. Invisible lines spreading through the rock, like fractures in glass. Dust poured down in thin streams. The air itself felt heavier, tenser, unstable, and still, the enemy kept moving. "They still don't see it," I said. Kale's voice dropped to almost a whisper. "They will." A pause, a breath, a moment stretched to its limit. And then, the ground shifted. Not violently, not yet. Just enough to break the illusion of stability. One of the leading Virex units stumbled. A single misstep. A single moment of imbalance. But in a formation that precise, that perfect, even a single disruption mattered. Units behind it adjusted. Pressure shifted. Weight redistributed. And deep beneath the canyon floor, something gave way. A crack. Sharp. Sudden. Echoing. Like a gunshot. Through the stone. Every Virex unit in the choke point stopped at once. For the first time since the battle began, they hesitated. And Kaal finally moved. His hand hovered over the trigger interface. Not rushing. Not reacting. But choosing. Because this wasn't about timing anymore. This was about inevitability. "They feel it now," I said. KL nodded once. "Yeah." His finger lowered slowly. "They do. There is a moment, right before everything falls apart, when the world seems to hesitate, as if reality itself is deciding whether to hold or to break." That was the moment we were standing in. The Virex Dominion had stopped. Not fully, not in retreat, but in confusion. Their formation perfect until now had faltered. Just slightly. Just enough. And that was all it took. The crack echoed again. Louder. This time, deeper. No longer hidden beneath the surface, but tearing through it. The ground beneath the lead units shifted. A subtle drop. Then another. Then, a section of the canyon floor collapsed. Not explosively, not violently, but suddenly, like something giving way after holding for too long. The front line of the Virex sank. Armor grinding against stone. Massive bodies dropping half a meter. Then more. Their formation broke instantly, not from damage, but from imbalance. Units collided, adjusted, tried to stabilize, but the ground beneath them wasn't stable anymore. It was failing. And that's when Kale triggered the first detonation. A sharp flash along the cliffside, then a deep, concussive impact, not aimed at the enemy, but at the rock above them. The weakened overhang shuddered. Cracks spread like lightning through stone. And then, gravity took over. The cliff came down. A massive section of rock collapsed into the choke point below. Not a clean fall, not a single impact, but a cascading avalanche of stone and debris. Thousands of tons crashing downward in a deafening roar. The Virex didn't react in time. They couldn't, because this wasn't an attack they recognized. There were no projectiles to intercept, no energy signatures to track, just the ground itself. Turning against them, the first wave was buried instantly, crushed beneath the weight of collapsing stone. Units behind them tried to halt, tried to pull back, but the canyon was too narrow, too crowded, too committed. And Kale wasn't finished. "Now," he said, More detonations followed. Not random, not chaotic, but chained. Each one triggering another section, each collapse feeding into the next. The canyon walls began to break apart in sequence. Controlled destruction, turning into unstoppable collapse. Dust erupted into the air, thick, blinding, swallowing entire formations in seconds. Sensors failed. Visuals disappeared. Communication lines fractured. The Virex Dominion, an army built on coordination and pressure, lost both at once. And in that moment, they became vulnerable. "They're blind," I said. Kale didn't answer. He was already moving, issuing commands across human channels. Short, precisi, unemocional. Phase 2. Move. From behind the ridge, human units advanced. Not in large formations, not in organized lines, but in small, fast-moving squads. They didn't charge into the chaos. They flowed into it, using the dust, using the debris, using the confusion. The battlefield had changed. Completely. This was no longer a canyon. It was a maze, a collapsing, shifting, unpredictable environment. And humans thrive in chaos. The Virex tried to recover. Rear units attempted to pull back. Front units attempted to push forward. But the path was gone, buried, broken, unrecognizable. And every movement they made it worse. More weight, more pressure, more instability. They're triggering the next layer themselves, I realized. Kale nodded. They always were. Another section collapsed. This time from below. The ground split open beneath a cluster of heavy units, dropping them into a widening fracture, crushing them under shifting rock and their own mass. Above, more debris fell. Not enough to kill outright, but enough to trap, to isolate, to divide the formation into fragments. And once divided, they were no longer an unstoppable force. They were targets. Human squads moved between the broken terrain, striking quickly, disappearing just as fast. Precision attacks against isolated units. Weak points exposed not by weapons, but by the environment itself. "They can't regroup," I said. "No," Kale replied, "because there's nothing left to regroup into." The dust thickened, turning the battlefield into a storm. Visibility dropped to almost nothing. Sound became distorted. Explosions echoing unpredictably through the canyon. And still, the collapse continued, layer after layer. Not one catastrophic event, but a series of failures, each one building on the last, each one amplifying the chaos. The Virex weren't just losing ground. They were losing understanding. Their entire doctrine depended on stability, on predictability, on control. And Kale had taken all of that away. "They're trying to adapt," I said. "They don't know how," he replied. Another detonation, another collapse, another section of the canyon giving way. And then, for the first time, the Virex Dominion did something they had never done before. They stopped advancing, completely. Not regrouping, not repositioning, just stopping, because they no longer trusted the ground beneath them. And that was the real victory. Not destruction, not casualties, but hesitation. Kale watched the battlefield silently. Dust swirling around us. The canyon no longer recognizable as the place it had been hours ago. "They thought this was their kind of war," he said quietly. "Below us, the remnants of their formation struggled to survive. Not to win, not to advance, just to exist. And the canyon kept collapsing. They were wrong. War doesn't break cleanly. It fractures into moments, into decisions, into chaos so complete that no one sees the whole battlefield anymore. Only fragments, only survival. That's what the canyon had become. Not a battlefield, but a storm. Dust choked the air, thick enough to turn light into shadows. Sound bounced unpredictably off broken rock. Gunfire, echoing from directions that didn't exist. Explosions muffled, then amplified. then lost entirely. Visibility dropped to almost nothing, and in that blindness, the Virex Dominion lost their greatest advantage: coordination. Their formations were gone, their lines shattered, their advance reduced to isolated pockets of units, trapped between collapsing terrain and an enemy they couldn't see. And that's when the humans struck, not as an army, but as hunters. Small squads moved through the debris, using terrain that shifted with every step. They didn't charge. They didn't hold positions. They appeared, struck, and disappeared again. Fast, precise, unpredictable. I followed one of the squads through the upper ridge descent. 3 soldiers. No heavy armor. No visible command structure. Just movement. Fluid. Controlled. They dropped into the dust without hesitation, landing between fractured rock formations, already moving before their feet fully hit the ground. A Virex unit emerged through the haze ahead. Massive, heavily armored, weapon systems scanning blindly through the dust. It fired. A burst of energy tore through the air, hitting nothing. Because the humans weren't where they were expected to be. They never were. One soldier flanked left. Another moved low across broken terrain. The third advanced directly, not charging, not rushing, but closing distance with terrifying calm. The Virex unit adjusted. Too slow. The ground beneath it shifted again. Just enough to throw off its balance. Just enough. That was all it took. The human soldier reached it. Close range. Too close for heavy weapons. A precise strike. Not against armor, but at the joints. At the points weakened by movement, by instability, by the environment itself. The Virex unit collapsed. Not from overwhelming force, but from perfect timing. And the squad moved on. No pause. No confirmation. Because in this battlefield, standing still was death. Everywhere I looked, the same pattern repeated. Not large engagement, not grand charges, but dozens, hundreds of small, brutal encounters. Each one fast, each one decisive, each one impossible to predict. The Virex tried to respond, tried to re-establish formation, but every attempt failed because the terrain wouldn't allow it. Paths that existed seconds ago were gone, buried under debris, collapsed into fractures, or simply no longer where they had been. And every time they adapted, the battlefield changed again. They're reacting to ghosts. I heard over comms. It was one of the human squad leaders. They're fighting what they think is there, not what actually is. Another explosion tore through the canyon. Not massive, not catastrophic, but perfectly placed, triggering another localized collapse, cutting off a cluster of Virex units from the rest, isolating them, turning them into targets. And then the close combat began. Not clean, not controlled, but brutal. Up close, the Virex were terrifying. Massive strength, reinforced armor, weapons designed to overpower anything in front of them. But those advantages relied on stability, on control, on predictable engagement. And here, they had none. A Virex warrior swung at a human soldier. The strike shattered rock where the soldier had been. A second too late. The human had already moved, using the debris, using the uneven ground, turning the enemy's size against it. Another strike, another miss, another shift in terrain, and then a counter, precise, targeted, effective. This wasn't a fair fight. It wasn't meant to be. It was survival through imbalance. And the humans understood that better than anyone. They're not fighting the enemy, I realized aloud. They're fighting the battlefield and winning. Kale's voice came through the comms, calm, steady, unshaken by the chaos. Keep them moving, he ordered. Don't let them stabilize. Every second they hesitate, the terrain does the work for us. That was the strategy. Not to destroy the enemy directly, but to keep them off balance long enough for the environment to finish it. Another section of the canyon gave way. This time above a cluster of Virex, attempting to regroup. They saw it coming, tried to move, but the ground beneath them shifted at the same time, slowing them, trapping them, just long enough. The collapse buried them completely. And still, the battle continued, because there were more, always more. The Virex dominion didn't break easily. Even in chaos, even in confusion. They adapted. Slowly, painfully, but they adapted. Rear units began spreading out, avoiding dense formations, testing the ground before advancing, trying to reclaim some measure of control. They're learning, I said. Kyle's response came instantly. Good. That surprised me. Good? If they adapt, he said, they'll change their movement. Pause. And that means they'll move exactly where we need them to. I didn't fully understand. Not yet, but I trusted it now, because everything I had seen so far, everything that should have failed, had worked. Not perfectly, not cleanly, but effectively. The canyon was no longer theirs. It was no longer ours either. It belonged to something else now, something unpredictable, something dangerous, something alive. And the humans were the only ones who knew how to survive inside it. Dust swirled. Rocks shifted. The battlefield continued to change with every passing second. And through it all, the Virex dominion kept fighting. But not to win anymore. To endure. To escape. To survive something they had never encountered before. A war where the ground itself was trying to kill them. And above it all, standing at the fractured edge of the ridge, Kyle watched. Not the chaos. Not the destruction, but the pattern beneath it, because this battle wasn't over yet, not even close. There is always a moment in battle when chaos begins to settle, not into peace, but into understanding, when both sides finally see the truth of what they're facing. For the Virex dominion, that moment came too late. The canyon was no longer collapsing randomly. It had a pattern now, a rhythm, and Kale was controlling it. I stood at the ridge as the battlefield below shifted from chaos into something more deliberate. The Virex had changed their strategy. They spread out, reduced formation density, tested every step before committing weight. They were learning, adapting, surviving. But adaptation has a cost. It slows you down. It makes you cautious. And in a battlefield designed to punish hesitation, that cost becomes lethal. They've stopped advancing, I said. Below us, the remnants of their force were no longer pushing forward. They were stabilizing, trying to secure ground, trying to rebuild structure from the ruins. KL nodded slightly. Yeah, they finally understand the battlefield. Pause. That's when it gets easier. That didn't make sense at first, until I saw what he was looking at. Not the center of the canyon, not the chaos, but the edges, the escape routes, the narrow side paths that still remained intact. Paths the Virex were beginning to move toward, slowly, carefully, trying to pull their forces out of the collapsing zones. They're retreating, I said. Not yet, Kale replied. They think they are. That was when I felt it again. That same shift in understanding, the same realization that had come too late for the enemy. This was never about destroying them in the choke point, I said slowly. Kale didn't answer, because he didn't need to. The truth was already there. They're moving exactly where you want them to go. He gave a small nod. Always were. The first phase had been chaos. Break their formation, blind them, force them to react. The second phase was control, guide their movement, shape their decisions, turn their survival instincts into predictable behavior. And now, we were entering the final phase. I looked at the outer edges of the canyon again. At the roots the Virex were converging toward. Narrow escape paths between cliff walls. Areas that hadn't collapsed yet. Areas that seemed stable, safe, uncompromised. They think those paths are clear, I said. KL's voice was quiet. They are. Pause. Until they're not. My chest tightened, because I understood now. Completely. You save them on purpose, I said. Those paths. You left them untouched. Of course, he replied. If everything collapses, they scatter. If they scatter, they survive. Another pause. So we give them hope. Hope. That was the final weapon. Not fear, not destruction, but the illusion of escape. The Virex forces began committing to the routes. Not all at once, not recklessly, but with growing confidence. Units regrouping just enough to move in coordinated lines again, funneling themselves into the only remaining exits. Exactly as planned. They're consolidating, I said. Yeah, Kale replied, making it easier. More units joined. More weight. More pressure. The escape routes began to fill. Not as tightly as the original choke point, but enough. Enough for what came next. Tell me those sections are stable, I said. Kale didn't look at me. No. That answer hit harder than anything else. Because this time, it wasn't controlled instability. It was something worse. Delayed. Hidden. Waiting. You built a second collapse, I whispered. Kale's gaze remained fixed on the canyon. Not built. Saved. That was the difference. He hadn't weakened those sections. He had left them intact. So they would bear the full weight of the retreat. So they would fail. All at once. Below us. The Virex began accelerating. Confidence returning. Movement becoming faster. More committed. They believed they had found a way out. Believed they had adapted. Believed they had survived. And for a moment, watching them move, even I almost believed it. Now, Kyle said softly. His hand moved to the trigger. But this time, there was no hesitation. No waiting. Because everything was already in place. The detonations came fast. Sharp, but it's easy. Not along the escape routes themselves, but above them, behind them, cutting off any chance of turning back. The cliffs trembled, cracks spreading faster than before. Deeper. Vita. The Virex unit stopped. Confusion spreading again. Too late. Way too late. The ground beneath the escape paths held. For one final second. One last illusion of stability. And then it gave way. Completely. Not in sections. Not in waves. But all at once. The entire escape route collapsed into the canyon below. Rock. Dust. And thousands of tons of terrain. Falling into itself. Carrying the Virex dominion with it. Units tried to escape. Tried to climb. Tried to stabilize. But there was nowhere to go. The ground was gone. Replaced by shifting debris and falling stone. Everything moved. Everything collapsed. Everything failed. The canyon became a grave. Not from a single strike, but from a perfect sequence of decisions. Every movement the enemy had made, every adaptation, every attempt to survive had led them here. To this moment, to this collapse. They walked into it. I said quietly. Kale nodded once. They always do. Below us, the last of the Virex formations disappeared beneath the falling terrain. Buried, crushed, erased. Not completely, not instantly, but effectively. Enough that the battle was no longer a battle, just the aftermath of one. Silence began to return, slowly, unevenly, broken only by the sound of settling rock, falling debris, and the distant echoes of something that had once been an army. I looked out over the canyon. No longer a battlefield, no longer a fortress, but something else entirely. A weapon that had already been used and spent. They thought they were fighting us, I said. KL finally turned away from the edge. They were, he replied. Pause. Then, they just didn't realize what we were using. When the noise fades, war doesn't end immediately. It lingers. In the air, in the ground, in the minds of those who survived it. That was the state of Corrales. Not victory. Not yet. Just silence. The kind that feels unnatural after so much chaos. The canyon no longer echoed with movement. No marching. No weapons firing. No command signals cutting through the air. Only the occasional shift of settling rock. and the slow descent of dust through broken light. I stood at the ridge long after the last collapse, long after the final detonation, watching what used to be a battlefield, trying to understand how something so massive could end so completely. The canyon was unrecognizable. Entire sections had fallen inward, cliff walls reshaped, paths erased. What had once been a structured approach, a predictable battlefield, was now a fractured wasteland of debris and unstable terrain, and somewhere beneath it all was the Virix dominion, or what was left of it. Thermal scans? I asked over comms. A delay. Then, a response. Minimal. Another pause. Scattered heat signatures. No large formations. That was confirmation. Not total annihilation, but something close enough. The kind of loss an army doesn't recover from. They're gone, someone whispered. Not in disbelief, but in quiet realization, because no one had expected this. Not like this. Not so decisively. Back in the command center, the atmosphere had changed. Not to celebration, not to relief, but to something heavier, something closer to shock. Holographic displays flickered with updated data, enemy numbers dropping, then disappearing entirely from major sectors. Remaining units isolated, trapped, irrelevant. They've lost command structure, a tactician said. No coordinated movement detected. They're not regrouping. They can't, another replied. Even if they tried, there's nowhere left to regroup. That was the truth. The battlefield itself had erased the possibility. I turned away from the display, back toward the canyon, where human units were already moving again. Not in combat, not aggressively, but carefully, systematically, clearing debris, securing paths, marking unstable areas, not celebrating, not even acknowledging what they had just done, just continuing, as if this was expected, as if this was normal. I found Kale where I'd left him, near the edge, looking out over the destruction. No triumph, no satisfaction, just quiet observation. It's over, I said. He didn't answer immediately. His gaze moved across the canyon, slowly, taking in every detail, every shift, every remaining movement. Finally, he nodded. Yeah, a pause. For them. That caught my attention. You don't sound surprised. Kale shrugged slightly. I was more worried about the parts we couldn't control. I stared at him. The entire battlefield just collapsed. And that's what worries you? He gave a faint, almost tired smile. Collapse is predictable, he said. People aren't. That was the difference. That was what made this work. Not just the plan, but the understanding behind it. The ability to predict behavior, to guide it, to use it. They did exactly what you expected, I said. Kale shook his head. No. Another pause. They did what anyone would do. That answer stayed with me, because it meant this wasn't about the Virix. It wasn't about a specific enemy. It was about something deeper, something universal. Pressure, fear, survival. All leading to the same choices, all leading to the same outcome. And KL had known that from the beginning. They never stood a chance, I said quietly. KL looked out over the canyon one last time, then finally stepped back from the edge. They did, he replied. That surprised me. Really? He nodded once. If they had stopped, a pause. If they had questioned the ground, if they had broken formation earlier, if they had chosen unpredictability over certainty. He shook his head, but they didn't, because they couldn't, because that wasn't how they fought, and that was why they lost. Behind us, the first full report came in. Casualty estimates, terrain analysis, enemy loss projections, numbers that didn't seem real, didn't feel real, because they were too large, too complete. Primary Virix force neutralized, the report concluded. Remaining units non-operational. Silence followed. Not celebration, not relief, just understanding. This wasn't just a victory. It was something else, something larger, something that would be studied, analyzed, remembered. because battles are won all the time. But this was something different. This was a battlefield turned into a weapon, and a war ended before it could fully begin. I looked at Kale again, at the man no one had trusted, no one had listened to, no one had believed in. And now there was nothing left to question. "You knew," I said. He didn't deny it. "I hoped," he corrected. "A small difference, but an important one. Because hope meant risk, and risk meant everything could have failed." "But it didn't," I said. Kale glanced back toward the canyon, then toward the horizon beyond it, where the sky was finally beginning to clear. "No," he said quietly, "it didn't." Silence stretched across the ridge. Not the uneasy silence of fear, but the heavy, reflective silence of comprehension. The Alliance commanders had gathered, their faces pale, eyes wide, not from battle scars, but from realization. "What? How?" one of them whispered. "Your defenses, the canyon, it's gone." I turned to Kale. He stood there, dust on his armor, hands resting lightly on the rail, calm, unshaken. "They underestimated you," I said quietly. Kale only shrugged. "More than that," he replied, voice low, deliberate. "They underestimated the humans." The commanders stepped forward, hesitant. Whispers turned into murmurs, murmurs into questions. What was your plan? Why didn't you?" Kale didn't answer their questions. Not immediately, because answers couldn't capture the truth. It wasn't in strategies, diagrams, or manuals. It was in understanding, in intuition, in seeing what the enemy could not, and acting before anyone else could even imagine it. Then the commander in charge spoke, slowly, carefully, with a weight in his voice I had never heard before. "You saved us all, and you did it with less than half our resources, less than a third of our forces, and against an enemy we thought invincible." Kale nodded slightly. "No pride, no triumph, just focus. Your gamble, your plan," the commander continued. "It worked, beyond anything we imagined." I watched as the rest of the Alliance soldiers started to understand. The whispers grew into acknowledgement, the acknowledgement into respect, the respect into something almost sacred. For the first time, Kale was no longer overlooked, no longer mocked, no longer underestimated. He had turned the impossible into reality. He had rewritten the rules of engagement, and everyone present knew it. Some came to shake his hand. Others bowed slightly, a rare gesture in a world hardened by war. But it didn't matter what they did. They couldn't fully express what he had achieved. And yet, that wasn't enough for Kale. He didn't ask for thanks. He didn't seek glory. He simply surveyed the battlefield, now quiet, now emptied of the enemy, and allowed a single thought to remain. "The fight isn't over," he said softly. "Not for everyone, not everywhere. But this was a lesson they'll never forget." It was recognition, yes, but it was more than that. It was proof. Proof that intelligence, courage, and creativity could overcome even the most overwhelming odds. The Alliance didn't just respect him, they understood him, and that understanding was worth more than any medal, rank, or accolade could ever convey. Because in that moment, Kale wasn't just a soldier. He was a legend. Perfect. Now we conclude the story with an emotional, powerful ending. This is the moment that leaves the audience with awe, respect, and inspiration. The canyon lay silent. Dust settled slowly through the shafts of light breaking over the jagged cliffs. The battlefield had been transformed, not by sheer numbers, not by unstoppable firepower, but by thought, by ingenuity, by human will. I watched Kale walk along the ridge, every step measured, every glance thoughtful. He wasn't celebrating. He didn't need to, because the victory was bigger than him, bigger than any one army, bigger than any single fight. It was proof that even when loss seems certain, when the enemy seems unbeatable, humans find a way. Small squads had moved through the chaos, saving lives, outsmarting destruction, turning a collapsing canyon into a weapon of survival. And yet, it wasn't about the battles they won. It was about the choices they made, the risks they took, the courage to act when everyone else hesitated, and to think when fear screamed to run. I followed Kale to the edge of the ridge. He looked down at the shattered canyon floor, where thousands had fallen, where survival had been earned, and where, somehow, the human spirit had shined brightest. "They'll remember this," I said quietly. Kale didn't speak immediately. Instead, he surveyed the horizon, the distant skies, the endless possibilities beyond the war. "They'll remember," he said finally, "not just what we did, but why we did it." And that was the lesson. It wasn't power. It wasn't brute force. It was resilience, intelligence, determination, the unyielding will to survive and to prevail, even when the odds were stacked impossibly high. I looked at him, at the soldier no one believed in, at the mind no one respected, at the force no one expected, and I understood. Humanity could rise from any collapse, any devastation, any war, and sometimes the underestimated hero was the one who changed everything. The wind swept through the canyon, carrying dust and silence and truth. And as Kale turned to walk away, I realized this was more than a victory. It was a promise that no matter how dark, how impossible, how inevitable loss may appear, humanity would rise, humanity would endure, humanity would fight, and humanity would win.